On a rain-soaked morning in March 1945, Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell stood on the dock at Norfolk Naval Base, watching a converted Liberty ship slowly approach through the grey Atlantic waters. The telegram in his pocket, now crumpled from repeated reading, had arrived 3 days earlier from the War Department. Prepare facilities for 127 German POWs arriving March 15th. Special circumstances require immediate attention. Classification: female auxiliary personnel. Mitchell had commanded prisoner of war facilities for 2 years, overseeing thousands of captured Wehrmacht soldiers, Luftwaffe pilots, and U-boat crews, but never women. The very concept seemed to challenge everything the American military establishment understood about warfare and captivity. As the gangplank lowered, Mitchell observed the first prisoners disembarking. Unlike the defiant German officers or the weary enlisted men he was accustomed to processing, these women moved with a different kind of dignity. They wore the distinctive grey uniforms of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, the Nachrichtenhelferin, and the various support units that had served alongside the Wehrmacht. Their faces, weathered by months of war but still holding traces of youth, reflected a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and stubborn pride. Among them was Oberhelferin Greta Zimmermann, a 24-year-old communications specialist from Munich. Her blonde hair, once meticulously styled according to military regulations, now hung in loose strands around her face. She carried a small leather satchel containing her identification papers, a worn photograph of her family's bakery, and a wooden rosary her grandmother had given her before she enlisted in 1943. Beside her walked Margaret Fischer, a nurse from Hamburg who had tended to wounded soldiers in field hospitals across the Eastern Front. Her medical bag, now empty except for a few bandages and a stethoscope, had been her constant companion through the retreat from Berlin. At 31, she was among the oldest in the group, and the younger women naturally looked to her for guidance in this unprecedented situation. The capture of these women had been entirely accidental. During the final Allied push into Germany, the 3rd Armored Division had overrun a communications bunker near Göttingen, where dozens of female auxiliaries were manning radio equipment, coordinating supply convoys, and providing medical support to retreating German forces. Rather than fleeing, they had remained at their posts, following orders to destroy sensitive documents and equipment before the Americans arrived. Captain Robert Hayes, the officer who had first encountered them, later wrote in his report, "The women showed no signs of resistance, but maintained military discipline throughout the capture process. They requested permission to complete their duties before surrendering their positions. Most unusual was their insistence on formal surrender procedures, as if they were regular combatants." The legal status of these prisoners had sparked heated debates in Washington. The Geneva Convention of 1929 provided clear guidelines for the treatment of male prisoners of war, but female combatants, or even non-combatant auxiliaries, occupied a grey area in international law. Some officials argued they should be classified as civilians and repatriated immediately. Others insisted that their military roles and uniforms qualified them for POW status. Secretary of War Henry Stimson had ultimately decided on a pragmatic approach: treat them as prisoners of war with all associated protections, but house them separately from male POWs. This decision led to the hurried conversion of a section of Camp Shanks in New York, normally used for troop staging, into the first facility specifically designed to hold female enemy prisoners on American soil. As the women were processed through the standard intake procedures, medical examinations, interrogation sessions, and assignment of prisoner numbers, the cultural shock became immediately apparent. The American WACs, Women's Army Corps, assigned to guard and supervise them, found themselves in an unprecedented situation. Corporal Betty Anderson, a farm girl from Iowa, later recalled her first encounter with the German auxiliaries. "I expected them to be different somehow, more masculine, I guess, like the Nazi propaganda made them out to be. Instead, they were just women, scared and far from home, trying to maintain their dignity in an impossible situation." The interrogation sessions revealed the diverse backgrounds of these prisoners. Many were educated middle-class women who had volunteered for service as an alternative to factory work. Others came from military families with long traditions of service to the fatherland. A significant number were from occupied territories, Polish, Czech, and Austrian women who had been recruited or conscripted into German auxiliary services. Oberfeldwebel Anna Richter, a radar operator from Vienna, spoke fluent English and often served as an interpreter during the initial processing. Born in 1920 to a family of musicians, she had been studying languages at the University of Vienna. When Austria was incorporated into the Third Reich, her decision to join the German Military Communications Corps had been motivated more by economic necessity than ideological conviction, a fact she was careful not to reveal during her interrogations. The American military psychiatrist assigned to evaluate the women, Major Dr. Eleanor Patterson, found herself fascinated by the psychological profiles emerging from her interviews. These women displayed none of the fanatical devotion to Nazi ideology we typically observed in male POWs, she noted in her confidential report. Their motivations were complex: duty, survival, family pressure, and in some cases genuine belief in defending their homeland. They saw themselves as soldiers, not as victims or zealots. The challenges of housing female POWs became apparent immediately. The converted barracks at Camp Shanks, hastily equipped with additional partitions for privacy, bore little resemblance to proper women's quarters. The guards, all female personnel drawn from various WAC units, had received no training for this unique assignment. Standard operating procedures developed for male prisoners often proved inadequate or inappropriate. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, the camp's assistant commandant and the highest-ranking woman officer, found herself navigating uncharted territory. A career military officer from Massachusetts, she had fought hard for respect in the male-dominated army structure. Now she faced the responsibility of establishing protocols for prisoners who challenged every assumption about women's roles in warfare. The first weeks were marked by constant adjustments and cultural misunderstandings. The German women maintained their military hierarchy even in captivity, with the senior auxiliaries continuing to command respect from their subordinates. They organized themselves into work details, maintained rigid schedules for personal hygiene and physical exercise, and insisted on formal military courtesy in their interactions with guards. This discipline both impressed and frustrated their captors. Captain Hayes, now serving as liaison between the camp and higher headquarters, observed, "They're more military than many of our own soldiers. Every morning they form up for roll call as if they're still on active duty. They salute their officers, maintain spotless quarters, and follow a chain of command that exists only in their minds now." The local American press, learning of the facility's unique inmates, began referring to them as Hitler's she-wolves and the Nazi Amazons, sensationalized titles that bore no resemblance to the reality inside the camp. The women themselves were largely unaware of the media attention, but they could sense the curiosity and sometimes hostility of the American personnel assigned to guard them. As spring turned to summer in 1945, news of Germany's surrender filtered through the camp. The reaction among the prisoners was not the despair or anger that officials had anticipated, but rather a kind of resigned relief. For many, the end of the war meant the end of the constant fear that had defined their service. Fear of death, of capture, of failing in their duties. Greta Zimmermann later wrote in her diary, "Today we learned that our beloved Germany has surrendered. I feel as if I am mourning not just a nation, but a part of myself. Yet there is also a strange peace in knowing that the killing has stopped. Perhaps now we can begin to understand what we have lived through, what we have been part of." The question now facing both prisoners and captors was what would come next. Unlike male POWs, who could be put to work in agriculture or industry under international law, the employment of female prisoners raised new legal and social questions. The women themselves, trained in technical and medical fields, possessed skills that were desperately needed in the post-war reconstruction effort, but using those skills might violate the principles of prisoner treatment. Dr. Patterson's psychological evaluations had revealed that many of the women were suffering from what would later be recognized as combat stress reactions. They had experienced bombing raids, artillery barrages, and the chaos of military retreat. Several had witnessed atrocities committed by retreating German forces against civilian populations. Others carried guilt over their participation in a war they were beginning to understand had involved unprecedented crimes against humanity. The camp's Catholic chaplain, Father Michael O'Brien, found himself counseling women who were grappling with questions of faith, duty, and moral responsibility. "They want to understand how they could have served a cause that led to such evil," he reported to his superiors. "Yet they also maintain pride in their service, in the competence and courage they showed under fire. It's a contradiction that haunts many of them. As autumn approached, the temporary nature of the women's imprisonment became increasingly apparent. Unlike male POWs, who might be held for years pending repatriation agreements, international pressure was mounting to resolve the status of the female auxiliaries. The Red Cross had begun documenting conditions in the camp, and European allies were requesting information about nationals among the prisoners. The women themselves had begun to organize educational activities to pass the time and maintain their skills. Margareta Fischer established informal medical training sessions, teaching basic first aid to younger prisoners. Several former teachers among the group organized language classes, with German women teaching English to recent arrivals while learning American slang from their guards. These interactions began to break down the barriers between captors and prisoners. Wake Corporal Jennifer Walsh, initially suspicious and hostile toward the German women, found herself impressed by their resilience and dignity. "You can't spend months guarding people without getting to know them as individuals," she later reflected. "These weren't the monsters we'd been prepared to hate. They were women like us, caught up in circumstances beyond their control." The revelation that several of the prisoners had risked their lives to help Allied prisoners of war in Germany created additional complications. Anna Richter admitted during one of her sessions with Dr. Patterson that she had secretly passed information to British POWs about impending transfers and had once provided medical supplies to injured airmen. Such actions, while admirable, further blurred the lines between friend and enemy. As winter approached, the women faced the prospect of spending Christmas in captivity, their first Christmas away from Germany since the war began. For many, this prospect was more daunting than the physical hardships of imprisonment. Letters from home, heavily censored and irregularly delivered, brought news of destroyed cities, missing family members, and a homeland they might no longer recognize. Greta Zimmermann received word that her family's bakery in Munich had been destroyed in Allied bombing raids, but that her parents and younger brother had survived. Margarete Fischer learned that her fiancé, a Luftwaffe pilot, was missing and presumed dead. Such news, while providing closure, also deepened their sense of displacement and uncertainty about the future. The camp's American personnel found themselves unexpectedly moved by the prisoners' plight. Lieutenant Morrison arranged for the women to receive Christmas packages from the American Red Cross, and several guards contributed personal items, soap, chocolate, and small trinkets, to supplement the official provisions. Father O'Brien organized an ecumenical Christmas service that brought together German Lutheran and Catholic prisoners with their American guards. The sight of former enemies singing Silent Night together in both German and English created a moment of unexpected harmony that would be remembered by participants long after the war's end. As 1945 drew to a close, the questions surrounding the German women auxiliaries remained unanswered. Their legal status was still under review, their future uncertain, and their place in the history of World War II yet to be written. But in the converted barracks of Camp Shanks, a unique chapter in the story of warfare and captivity was unfolding, one that would challenge assumptions about gender, duty, and the nature of conflict itself. The women who had once served the Third Reich now found themselves at the center of a different kind of battle, a struggle to maintain their identity and dignity while coming to terms with their role in one of history's greatest tragedies. Their story, largely forgotten by official histories, reveals the complex human dimensions of a war that reshaped not only nations but also fundamental assumptions about women's place in military conflict. The harsh winter of 1946 brought unprecedented challenges to Camp Shanks as the facility struggled to accommodate its unique population of female prisoners of war. The temporary structures, hastily converted the previous year, now groaned under the weight of snow and ice, their thin walls providing little insulation against the bitter New York cold. Inside the barracks, German auxiliary personnel huddled around improvised heating systems, their breath visible in the frigid air as they maintained the rigid routines that had sustained them through months of captivity. Oberhelferin Greta Zimmermann had become something of an unofficial leader among the prisoners, her fluent English and natural authority making her an intermediary between the German women and their American captors. On this particular February morning, she stood before the assembled prisoners in Barrack C, reading from a letter that had arrived from the International Red Cross regarding potential repatriation procedures. "The Commission states that negotiations are proceeding slowly," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the cold air. "They emphasize that our status as auxiliaries, rather than combat personnel, complicates the legal framework for our release. We must prepare ourselves for the possibility of extended detention." The response from the assembled women was mixed. Some, particularly the younger prisoners, showed visible distress at the news. Others, like Margaret Fisher, the former nurse who had become the group's unofficial medical officer, maintained the stoic expression that had served them throughout their ordeal. The daily routine at Camp Shanks had evolved significantly since the women's arrival. What had begun as a standard prisoner of war facility had gradually transformed into something resembling a women's work camp, though the nature of the work performed raised constant questions about the appropriate treatment of female POWs under international law. The morning began at 0600 hours with roll call, conducted in the same military fashion the women had known throughout their service. Unlike male POW camps, where prisoners often displayed subtle resistance to such procedures, the German auxiliaries maintained perfect formation and military courtesy. Their American guards, initially suspicious of this discipline, had come to appreciate the order it brought to camp operations. After a breakfast of oatmeal, powdered eggs, and coffee that bore little resemblance to the ersatz varieties they had consumed during wartime Germany, the women were divided into work details. The assignments reflected both their specialized skills and the unique challenges their captors faced in employing female prisoners. The largest group, comprising former communication specialists like Anna Richter, worked in the camp's administrative offices. Their fluency in multiple languages and familiarity with military documentation systems made them invaluable in processing the massive paperwork generated by POW operations throughout the United States. Under the supervision of WAC personnel, they translated documents, maintained prisoner records, and assisted in correspondence with international organizations. This arrangement created an unusual dynamic where former enemies worked side by side with American military personnel. Sergeant Dorothy Holmes, a WAC administrator from Detroit, found herself relying daily on Anna Richter's expertise in deciphering German military communications. "I never thought I'd be asking a German prisoner to explain their own army's procedures to me," she later wrote to her family. "But Anna knows those systems better than anyone, and she's genuinely helpful. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about the enemy." The medical detachment, led by Margarete Fischer, presented even greater complexities. Fischer's experience treating combat casualties far exceeded that of most American military nurses, and her knowledge of trauma surgery techniques had already saved the life of an American guard who suffered a severe accident during construction work at the camp. The ethical implications of using enemy prisoners to provide medical care to American personnel sparked heated debates in military circles. Dr. Eleanor Patterson, the camp's psychiatrist, had documented numerous cases where the German nurses displayed skills and knowledge that could benefit the broader medical community. "These women have treated wounds and conditions that American medical personnel may never encounter in their careers," she reported to the Surgeon General's office. "Their experiences on the Eastern Front, while gained in service to our enemy, represent valuable medical knowledge that could save American lives in future conflicts." The most controversial work assignment involved the seamstresses and logistics specialists who were employed in manufacturing clothing and equipment for other POW camps throughout the United States. The irony of German prisoners producing items for the detention of their own countrymen was not lost on either the prisoners or their captors, yet the arrangement continued out of practical necessity. Elfriede Weber, a former supply sergeant from Bremen, supervised a group of 20 women who operated sewing machines in a converted warehouse. Their production of prison uniforms, bedding, and other textile goods generated significant cost savings for the military, while providing the prisoners with meaningful work that helped pass the long hours of captivity. "We take pride in our work," Weber explained to a visiting Red Cross inspector. "Even in these circumstances, we maintain German standards of quality and efficiency. Perhaps it is foolish to work so hard for our captors, but idleness would be worse for our souls." The question of compensation for this labor created additional legal complexities. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be required to work, but they were entitled to payment for their efforts. The sight of German POWs receiving wages from the American government struck some observers as absurd, yet it was legally mandated. Most of the women chose to send their earnings to family members in Germany, providing crucial support to relatives struggling in the post-war economic collapse. The social dynamics within the camp reflected the complex hierarchies that had existed within German auxiliary services. Former officers like Greta Zimmermann continued to command respect from subordinates, maintaining military protocols even without official authority. This internal organization served both to preserve dignity and to provide structure in an otherwise uncertain environment. However, tensions occasionally emerged between different groups of prisoners. Women from occupied territories, Poles, Czechs, and Austrians who had been conscripted into German service, sometimes clashed with voluntary recruits from Germany proper. These conflicts reflected broader questions of loyalty, coercion, and collaboration that would continue to haunt post-war Europe for generations. Stanisława Kowalski, a former radio operator from Kraków, who had been conscripted into the German Communications Corps in 1943, found herself caught between her Polish identity and her shared experience with the German women. Her fluency in multiple languages made her valuable to camp administrators, but her presence created discomfort among prisoners who viewed her as a fellow Pole forced into enemy service. "I do not know who I am supposed to be anymore," she confided to Father O'Brien during one of his counseling sessions. "Am I Polish? Am I German? Am I just a prisoner? The other women treat me with kindness, but I see questions in their eyes. I have questions in my own eyes when I look at them." The American guards assigned to the facility faced their own challenges in adapting to their unique responsibilities. The WAC personnel selected for the assignment had been chosen for their experience and maturity, but nothing in their training had prepared them for the complexities of guarding female enemy prisoners. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, the assistant camp commandant, had established protocols that balanced security requirements with recognition of the prisoners' gender-specific needs. Female guards accompanied prisoners to all work assignments, medical appointments, and recreational activities. Privacy arrangements for bathing and personal hygiene were maintained, despite the facility's inadequate infrastructure. The guards themselves were often surprised by the prisoners' conduct and attitudes. Corporal Betty Anderson, initially hostile toward the German women, found her perceptions gradually changing through daily interaction. "They're not what I expected," she wrote to her parents in Iowa. "They follow rules, they work hard, and they treat each other with respect. Some of them remind me of my own sisters." This evolving relationship between guards and prisoners created what Dr. Patterson termed collaborative captivity, a situation where the normal adversarial dynamic between captors and captured gave way to pragmatic cooperation. The women's technical skills made them indispensable to camp operations, while their discipline reduced the security concerns typically associated with prisoner management. The educational activities that had begun informally during the women's first months in captivity expanded into a comprehensive program that resembled a small university. Former teachers among the prisoners offered classes in languages, mathematics, and sciences. Margaret Fisher conducted medical training sessions that attracted both German prisoners and American personnel. Hannah Richter taught courses in communications technology that proved valuable to WAC operators, learning new radio procedures. These educational exchanges created unexpected bonds between former enemies. WAC Sergeant Janet Murphy, initially assigned to monitor the German classes for security purposes, found herself becoming a student of German language and culture. Her growing friendship with several prisoners challenged her preconceptions about the nature of warfare and national identity. "They're teaching me their language, and I'm teaching them about America," she wrote in her diary. "Sometimes I forget we were enemies just a year ago. They laugh at the same things we do, worry about their families like we do, and dream about the future like we do. It makes the whole war seem like a terrible mistake that nobody really wanted." The arrival of spring in 1946 brought renewed hope for repatriation, but also growing awareness that the process would be more complex than anyone had anticipated. The collapse of Germany's government and economy meant that returning the women to their homeland might condemn them to starvation or worse. Many had no homes to return to, their cities destroyed by Allied bombing or occupied by Soviet forces. Intelligence reports filtering through official channels painted a grim picture of conditions in occupied Germany. The rape and murder of German women by occupation forces, particularly in the Soviet zone, made repatriation a potentially death sentence for some prisoners. This reality forced American officials to reconsider the moral implications of their captivity policies. Greta Zimmermann received a letter from her surviving brother, indicating that their hometown of Munich was under American occupation and relatively stable. However, other prisoners faced bleaker prospects. Several women from eastern regions now under Soviet control had no information about surviving family members and faced the possibility of being classified as traitors if they returned to areas controlled by Stalin's forces. The camp's chaplains, Father O'Brien and Pastor David Miller, found themselves counseling women who were grappling not only with their uncertain future, but also with growing awareness of the atrocities committed by the regime they had served. The revelation of concentration camps and systematic murder campaigns had reached the prisoners through carefully controlled news broadcasts and Red Cross publications. "So how do we live with the knowledge of what was done in our name?" Margaret Fisher asked during one of her sessions with Dr. Patterson. "We served honorably, following orders, caring for the wounded, yet we were part of a machine that committed such evil. How do we reconcile these truths?" This moral reckoning became a central theme in the camp during 1946, as the women struggled to understand their role in history's greatest tragedy. Some maintained that they had served only Germany, not the Nazi Party, and bore no responsibility for crimes they had not personally committed. Others accepted collective guilt for their participation in the Wehrmacht, regardless of their individual actions. The American personnel observing this process found themselves confronted with their own assumptions about guilt, complicity, and redemption. The women they had come to know as individuals, skilled, disciplined, and often admirable, were also representatives of a regime that had attempted genocide and world conquest. As summer arrived, bringing with it the promise of eventual resolution to their captivity, the German auxiliary personnel at Camp Shanks had become something unprecedented in military history, a community of former enemies who had found common ground with their captors in the shared recognition of their humanity. Their story would soon enter a new chapter, as the realities of post-war politics and economics began to shape their ultimate fate. The question was no longer simply when they would be released, but where they would go and who they would become in a world forever changed by the conflict they had served and survived. By the autumn of 1946, Camp Shanks had evolved into something that defied conventional military categories. The facility, originally designed as a temporary holding area for enemy prisoners, had become a microcosm of post-war uncertainty, where German auxiliary personnel and their American captors navigated uncharted territory together. The relationships that had developed between former enemies reflected broader questions about justice, reconciliation, and the possibility of redemption in the wake of unprecedented horror. The arrival of autumn brought disturbing news from occupied Germany that would profoundly impact the fate of the women prisoners. Reports from the American occupation zone described widespread starvation, economic collapse, and social chaos that made immediate repatriation problematic. More troubling were accounts from the Soviet-controlled eastern regions, where returning German military personnel, including women auxiliaries, faced imprisonment, forced labor, or worse. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, still commanding the facility, found himself in an impossible position. International law required the repatriation of prisoners of war, yet returning the women to Germany might condemn many to death or brutalization. His correspondence with higher headquarters revealed the frustration of military officials grappling with legal and moral obligations that seemed to conflict with humanitarian concerns. "We are legally bound to return these prisoners to their homeland," he wrote to the War Department, yet intelligence reports suggest that doing so would violate our fundamental obligation to ensure their safety and well-being. I request guidance on how to proceed in this unprecedented situation. The women themselves were acutely aware of the dilemma their captors faced. Through carefully monitored letters from home and conversations with newly arrived Red Cross representatives, they had learned of the harsh conditions awaiting them in Germany. Several had received news that their hometowns were now in the Soviet zone of occupation, making their return potentially fatal. Stanisława Kowalski, the Polish-born radio operator who had been conscripted into German service, faced particularly complex circumstances. Her hometown of Krakow was now under Polish communist control, and her service with German forces marked her as a collaborator subject to imprisonment or execution. The prospect of returning to either Germany or Poland offered only different varieties of persecution. "I am a woman without a country," she confided to Greta Zimmermann during one of their evening conversations. "Poland will not forgive my service to Germany, and Germany is no longer a place where I belong. Perhaps America will become home for those of us who fit nowhere else." This conversation reflected a growing reality among the prisoners. Many were beginning to see their extended captivity not as punishment, but as an unexpected opportunity for survival and reinvention. The skills they had developed, the English they had learned, and the relationships they had formed with American personnel suggested possibilities for life beyond repatriation. The American guards and administrators had also undergone profound changes during their months of supervising female POWs. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, initially focused solely on security and protocol, had developed genuine respect and affection for many of the women under her supervision. Her weekly reports began to reflect personal investment in their welfare rather than mere professional duty. "The prisoners have maintained exemplary conduct throughout their detention," she wrote in her October assessment. "Their work contributions have been invaluable to camp operations and to the broader POW administration system. Many possess skills and qualifications that could benefit American society if immigration provisions could be established." This suggestion that valuable enemy personnel might be allowed to remain in the United States rather than being repatriated represented a radical departure from standard military thinking. Yet it reflected growing recognition that the aftermath of World War II would require unprecedented solutions to unprecedented problems. Dr. Eleanor Patterson's psychological evaluations had documented the remarkable adaptation and resilience displayed by the German women. Her research, which would later influence military policies regarding female personnel and prisoners, revealed the complex factors that had motivated their wartime service and shaped their responses to captivity. These women joined auxiliary services for diverse reasons, her comprehensive report noted. Economic necessity, family tradition, patriotic duty, and escape from limited civilian opportunities all played roles in their decisions. Their conduct in captivity suggests that they were motivated more by professional competence than ideological fanaticism. The report included detailed case studies that illustrated the human complexity behind enemy service. Margaret Fisher, the Hamburg nurse, had enlisted after her civilian hospital was destroyed in Allied bombing raids, viewing military medical service as her only opportunity to continue her calling. Anna Richter had joined communications units to avoid factory work and support her widowed mother. Their stories reflected the ordinary human motivations that could lead individuals into extraordinary circumstances. The work assignments within the camp had evolved to take advantage of the women's specialized skills, while providing them with meaningful activity during their extended detention. The administrative section, where former communications specialists processed military paperwork, had become so efficient that other POW camps began requesting similar assistance from their German prisoners. Anna Richter had become indispensable to the camp's operations, her expertise in radio communications and multiple languages making her an unofficial liaison between different prisoner populations throughout the United States. Her daily routine included translating intercepted German communications, updating prisoner records, and coordinating with Red Cross representatives investigating conditions in various camps. "Anna knows more about our own prisoner operations than most of our officers," observed Captain Robert Hayes, who had originally captured the women near Göttingen. "She's created filing systems and communication protocols that have improved efficiency throughout the Northeast region. It seems absurd that someone so valuable to our operations is technically our enemy." The medical section, under Margaret Fisher's unofficial leadership, had expanded beyond basic prisoner health care to include research and training activities that benefited both German prisoners and American personnel. Fisher's experience treating combat injuries, particularly the devastating wounds produced by modern artillery and aerial bombardment, provided valuable knowledge for American military medical personnel preparing for potential future conflicts. A training program established by Fisher attracted medical personnel from throughout the region who came to learn techniques developed on the brutal Eastern Front. Her lectures on trauma surgery, infection control under battlefield conditions, and psychological treatment of combat stress were attended by American doctors and nurses eager to absorb hard-won expertise. Margaret Fisher has taught us more about combat medicine in 6 months than we learned in years of peacetime training, reported Major Susan Davis, Chief Medical Officer for the Regional POW Administration. Her knowledge could save countless American lives if we ever face combat conditions again. It seems tragic to waste such expertise through repatriation to a country that may not survive in its present form. The educational programs within the camp had expanded into what resembled a small university, offering courses in languages, sciences, literature, and practical skills. The German women served as both teachers and students, sharing their expertise while learning about American culture and society. These exchanges created unexpected bonds that transcended national boundaries and wartime enmities. WX Sergeant Janet Murphy had become fluent in German through her interactions with the prisoners, while simultaneously teaching English classes that were attended by women from throughout the camp. Her growing friendship with several prisoners had challenged her fundamental assumptions about nationality, loyalty, and the nature of conflict. "I've learned more about European history and culture from these women than I ever did in school," she wrote to her family in Pennsylvania. "They're not the monsters we were taught to expect. They're teachers, nurses, technicians, professional women who ended up on the wrong side of history through circumstances often beyond their control." The relationships that had developed between guards and prisoners reflected broader questions about the nature of enemy identity and the possibility of reconciliation. Many American personnel found themselves advocating for the women under their supervision, arguing that their skills and character made them potential assets to American society rather than threats to be eliminated. This evolving dynamic created tension between local camp officials, who had come to appreciate the prisoners as individuals, and higher military authorities, who remained focused on legal protocols and security concerns. The War Department's instructions remained clear. German POWs were to be repatriated as soon as practical arrangements could be made. However, practical considerations were beginning to override legal requirements. Reports from Germany indicated that the infrastructure for receiving and processing repatriated prisoners had collapsed in many regions. The chaos of occupied Germany, combined with the massive displacement of populations, made immediate repatriation both logistically difficult and potentially dangerous for the prisoners themselves. The women at Camp Shanks were increasingly aware that their fate would be determined by forces beyond their control. Political negotiations between former allies were breaking down as Cold War tensions emerged, making the resolution of prisoner issues more complex. Their status as auxiliaries rather than combat personnel added legal complications that delayed decision-making at the highest levels of government. In this uncertain environment, the women focused on maintaining their dignity and preparing for an unknown future. The routines they had established, work assignments, educational activities, religious services, and recreational programs, provided structure and purpose during months of extended captivity. Greta Zimmermann had emerged as their unofficial spokesperson in dealings with camp authorities and visiting officials. Her command of English and natural leadership abilities made her an effective advocate for the group's welfare and interests. She worked closely with Lieutenant Morrison to address practical concerns and maintain the cooperative atmosphere that had developed within the camp. "We understand that our situation is unprecedented," she told a visiting delegation from the International Red Cross. "We appreciate the humane treatment we have received from our captors, and we hope that our cooperation has demonstrated our commitment to peaceful coexistence. Whatever our ultimate fate, we wish to be remembered as women who maintained their honor and humanity under difficult circumstances." The delegation's report praised the conditions at Camp Shanks and the conduct of both prisoners and their American supervisors. However, it also noted the legal and diplomatic complications surrounding the women's status and recommended urgent action to resolve their situation before winter made repatriation even more difficult. As 1946 drew to a close, the German auxiliary personnel at Camp Shanks faced their second Christmas in American captivity. The holiday preparations reflected the unique culture that had developed within the camp, a blend of German traditions, American customs, and the practical realities of prison life. Father O'Brien and Pastor Miller, organized ecumenical services that brought together prisoners and guards in celebration of shared faith and humanity. The sight of former enemies singing traditional Christmas carols in multiple languages provided powerful testimony to the transformative potential of human contact across national and cultural boundaries. Yet beneath the surface of seasonal celebration lay profound uncertainty about the future. The women knew that decisions made in distant capitals would soon determine whether they returned to a devastated homeland, remained in extended captivity, or found some third option that had yet to be imagined. Their story, largely unknown to the American public and absent from official military histories, represented one of the most unusual chapters in the annals of warfare and captivity. As winter settled over Camp Shanks, the German women auxiliaries continued their daily routines, maintained their dignity, and waited to learn what history would ultimately make of their unprecedented experience as female prisoners of war in America. The spring of 1947 arrived at Camp Shanks with a mixture of hope and apprehension that reflected the broader uncertainties of the post-war world. Nearly 2 years had passed since the German auxiliary personnel first stepped off the Liberty ship at Norfolk, and their extended captivity had created a unique community that defied conventional categories of friend and enemy. As political negotiations finally began to resolve their status, both prisoners and their American captors faced the prospect of separation with emotions that ranged from relief to genuine grief. The breakthrough had come through an unexpected combination of legal precedent and humanitarian necessity. The International Committee of the Red Cross, working with American and European authorities, had developed new protocols for the repatriation of auxiliary personnel that recognized both their non-combatant status and their vulnerable position in occupied Germany. Rather than immediate return to a chaotic homeland, the women would be given options that reflected the complex realities of post-war reconstruction. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell received the final directive from Washington in March 1947, outlining 3 possibilities for the German prisoners under his command. They could choose immediate repatriation to whatever remained of their pre-war homes, delayed repatriation with temporary settlement in refugee camps operated by international organizations, or, in exceptional circumstances, application for immigration to the United States or other allied nations willing to accept former enemy personnel with valuable skills. The announcement of these options created intense discussion among the prisoners who had spent months contemplating their uncertain future. For many, the choice represented not merely a decision about geography, but a fundamental question of identity and belonging in a world irrevocably changed by 6 years of total war. Greta Zimmermann found herself at the center of these deliberations, as women throughout the camp sought her counsel in making decisions that would shape the rest of their lives. Her own choice seemed clear. Her family's bakery in Munich, though destroyed, could be rebuilt under American occupation. Her brother had written that reconstruction was beginning, and familiar faces from their neighborhood were slowly returning from military service or displacement. "I must return to Germany," she told the assembled women in Barracks C during one of their evening discussions. "Not because it will be easy, but because it is who I am. We cannot abandon our homeland simply because it has suffered defeat. Someone must help rebuild what we have lost." Her words carried weight among the prisoners, many of whom shared her sense of duty to a shattered nation, yet others faced circumstances that made such loyalty potentially fatal. Stanisława Kowalski, the Polish-born radio operator, represented one extreme of their dilemma. Neither Germany nor Poland offered her safety. The former viewed her as a foreign collaborator, while the latter considered her a traitor for her service with German forces. "America has shown me more kindness in 2 years of captivity than either of my supposed homelands offered in all my life before the war," she confided to Dr. Eleanor Patterson during one of their final counseling sessions. "Perhaps it is time to choose belonging over birth, hope over history." Margaret Fisher faced her own complex choice. The Hamburg nurse had received word that her city was slowly recovering under British occupation, and her medical skills were desperately needed in German hospitals struggling to treat refugees and displaced persons. Yet her months at Camp Shanks had also brought offers from American medical institutions, impressed by her expertise in trauma surgery and combat medicine. Dr. Patterson had facilitated correspondence between Fisher and several American hospitals, seeking experienced medical personnel for emergency departments and trauma units. The irony was not lost on anyone that a former enemy's knowledge of treating combat wounds could benefit American civilians injured in automobile accidents and industrial mishaps. "I became a nurse to heal people," Fisher told Lieutenant Sarah Morrison during one of their regular discussions about camp operations. "The nationality of my patients has never mattered to me. Perhaps my calling is to serve wherever my skills can do the most good, regardless of flags or boundaries." The practical aspects of these decisions created additional complications for camp administrators. Those choosing immediate repatriation required transportation arrangements and coordination with occupation authorities in Germany. Women opting for refugee status needed placement in displaced persons camps and processing through international relief organizations. Most complex were the cases of those seeking to remain in the United States, which required immigration proceedings, security clearances, and sponsor arrangements. Anna Richter represented the most straightforward case among those seeking American residency. Her expertise in communications technology had attracted attention from military contractors, developing new radio and radar systems for the emerging Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union. Several companies had expressed interest in hiring her, provided she could obtain the necessary security clearances and immigration documentation. The irony of employing former German military specialists to counter Soviet threats was not lost on American officials, who were simultaneously negotiating with German scientists and engineers through programs like Operation Paperclip. Richter's case became a test of whether such arrangements could extend beyond rocket scientists and nuclear physicists to include personnel with more conventional but equally valuable skills. Anna Richter knows more about German military communications than anyone in American custody, reported Captain Robert Hayes in his recommendation for her immigration application. Her knowledge could prove invaluable in understanding and countering Soviet communication systems, which are largely based on captured German technology. Denying ourselves her expertise while our former ally becomes our adversary seems strategically foolish. The American personnel who had supervised the women's captivity found themselves unexpectedly invested in their individual outcomes. Lieutenant Morrison had developed genuine affection for many of the prisoners and worked tirelessly to facilitate their chosen paths forward. Her efforts went far beyond official duties, including personal correspondence with potential American sponsors and detailed character references for immigration applications. WAC Sergeant Janet Murphy had become particularly close to several of the younger prisoners, relationships that had evolved from guard prisoner supervision to something resembling sisterhood. Her letters to family members in Pennsylvania were filled with requests for assistance in finding employment and housing for German women seeking to build new lives in America. "These women have become my friends," she wrote to her parents. "I know that sounds strange, given that we were enemies just 2 years ago, but shared experience has a way of breaking down barriers that politics and propaganda create. Several of them remind me of my own sisters, intelligent, hard-working women who found themselves caught up in circumstances beyond their control." The educational and cultural exchanges that had flourished during the women's captivity continued even as their community prepared to dissolve. German language classes remained popular among American personnel, while English instruction for the prisoners intensified as departure dates approached. These linguistic bridges had created lasting connections that would endure long after the physical separation imposed by repatriation. Father O'Brien and Pastor Miller had organized what they called testimony sessions, where women could share their stories and reflections on their wartime experiences and months in captivity. These gatherings served both therapeutic and historical purposes, creating an oral record of perspectives rarely documented in official military accounts. "We have witnessed something unprecedented in the history of warfare," Father O'Brien observed in his final report to military chaplain services. "The transformation of enemies into individuals, the recognition of common humanity across battle lines, and the possibility of reconciliation even in the aftermath of total war. These women's stories deserve to be preserved, not as propaganda for any particular viewpoint, but as testimony to the complexity of human motivation and the potential for redemption." The psychological impact of separation began to manifest itself as departure dates were finalized. Women who had maintained remarkable composure throughout their captivity now showed signs of anxiety and depression as they faced the prospect of leaving the community that had sustained them through their ordeal. Dr. Patterson documented what she termed anticipatory grief, mourning for relationships and routines that would soon end. These women have created a family structure within the constraints of military captivity, her final psychological assessment noted. The prospect of dissolution of this community creates stress responses similar to those observed in actual family separations. Many are more anxious about leaving Camp Shanks than they were about their original capture and detention. The camp's daily routines continued, even as the population began to decline through staged departures. The first group to leave consisted of women choosing immediate repatriation, primarily those with intact family connections in the American and British occupation zones of Germany. Their departure in late April 1947 was marked by formal ceremonies that honored both their service as prisoners and their courage in facing an uncertain future. Greta Zimmermann was among this first group, her decision to return to Munich, reflecting her deep attachment to her homeland, despite its current devastation. Her farewell address to the remaining prisoners emphasized themes of dignity, hope, and the importance of remembering their shared experience regardless of where their separate paths might lead. "We came here as prisoners and enemies," she told the assembled women and their American guards. "We leave as something different, as individuals who have learned that humanity transcends nationality, that understanding can bridge even the deepest divides created by war. Whatever our futures hold, we carry with us the knowledge that former enemies can become friends, that respect can grow from mutual recognition of common struggles and shared hopes." The ceremony marking her departure was attended by American personnel throughout the camp, many of whom had requested permission to bid farewell to prisoners who had become colleagues and friends. Lieutenant Morrison presented Zimmermann with a letter of commendation that praised her leadership and cooperation throughout the detention period, along with contact information that would allow continued correspondence. The second group to depart included women choosing placement in displaced persons camps, primarily those from eastern regions now under Soviet control who feared direct repatriation. Their destination was a specially designated facility in Austria operated by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, where they would await permanent resettlement opportunities. Elfriede Weber, the former supply sergeant from Bremen, chose this option after learning that her hometown was in the British zone, but that her immediate family had been killed during the final Soviet offensive. The prospect of returning to an empty city held little appeal compared to the possibility of eventual emigration to Australia or Canada, countries actively recruiting displaced persons with technical skills. The final group, comprising those seeking to remain in the United States, faced the most complex departure process. Immigration procedures, security investigations, and sponsor arrangements required additional months of processing, during which Camp Shanks gradually emptied of its unique population. Anna Richter was among the last to leave, her case having attracted attention at the highest levels of government as officials debated the wisdom of employing former enemy personnel in sensitive positions. Her eventual approval for immigration represented a precedent that would influence American policies regarding the recruitment of foreign technical specialists throughout the Cold War era. Stanisława Kowalski's case proved more challenging, as her status as a conscripted auxiliary from occupied territory created legal complications that required special legislation. Her eventual immigration was facilitated by Polish-American organizations that had lobbied Congress to recognize the distinction between voluntary collaboration and forced service under enemy occupation. Margaret Fisher chose a middle path, accepting a temporary position with the International Red Cross that would allow her to work with refugees throughout Europe while maintaining the option of eventual immigration to the United States. Her expertise in treating trauma and displacement-related medical conditions made her valuable to humanitarian organizations struggling to address the massive health crises created by post-war population movements. By the summer of 1947, Camp Shanks had returned to its original function as a military staging area, with no visible reminder of its 2-year role as America's only facility for female prisoners of war. The barracks that had housed German auxiliary personnel were converted back to standard military use, and new personnel arrived with no knowledge of the unique community that had flourished within the camp's confines. Yet the impact of the women's presence extended far beyond the physical boundaries of their captivity. The American personnel who had supervised them carried forward lessons about the complexity of enemy identity and the possibility of reconciliation that would influence their subsequent military and civilian careers. Many maintained correspondence with former prisoners, creating networks of friendship that spanned continents and persisted for decades. Dr. Patterson's research on the psychological aspects of female captivity influenced military policies regarding the treatment of prisoners and the integration of women into combat-related roles. Her documentation of the German auxiliaries' resilience, adaptability, and professional competence provided evidence that challenged prevailing assumptions about women's capabilities in military contexts. The legal precedents established through the women's cases contributed to the development of international law regarding non-combatant personnel and the rights of auxiliary forces. Their treatment at Camp Shanks was cited in subsequent Geneva Convention revisions as an example of humane detention practices that balanced security requirements with recognition of prisoner dignity and individual circumstances. The women themselves dispersed across continents, carrying with them memories of an experience that had transformed their understanding of nationality, loyalty, and human possibility. Those who returned to Germany contributed to reconstruction efforts with skills enhanced by their American captivity and perspectives broadened by their contact with former enemies who had become friends. Greta Zimmermann rebuilt her family's bakery in Munich and became active in German-American friendship organizations, hosting visiting American military personnel and participating in cultural exchange programs. Her correspondence with Lieutenant Morrison continued for over 30 years, documenting the parallel challenges of rebuilding Germany and adjusting to peacetime military service. Those who emigrated to new countries brought with them not only technical skills, but also unique perspectives on reconciliation and international cooperation. Anna Richter's work with American communications companies contributed to technological developments that helped maintain Western unity during the Cold War, while her advocacy for German-American scientific cooperation influenced policies that facilitated the integration of former enemy personnel into Allied defense efforts. Margarete Fischer's humanitarian work with refugees throughout Europe earned international recognition and contributed to the development of modern trauma medicine. Her techniques for treating psychological as well as physical wounds became standard practice in refugee camps and disaster response operations worldwide. Stanisława Kowalski found in America the sense of belonging that had eluded her in Europe, becoming a citizen in 1952 and raising a family that embodied the possibilities of new beginning in a land that judged individuals by their contributions rather than their origins. Her children grew up knowing that their mother had once been an enemy prisoner who became an American citizen through the recognition of common humanity that transcended national boundaries. The story of the German auxiliary personnel at Camp Shanks remained largely unknown to the American public, overshadowed by more dramatic accounts of major battles and political negotiations. Yet for those who lived it, prisoners and captors alike, the experience represented a profound lesson in the possibility of finding common ground even in the aftermath of history's most devastating conflict. As the years passed and Cold War tensions replaced World War II enmities, the women's story took on new relevance as evidence that former enemies could become allies when mutual respect and understanding replaced propaganda and prejudice. Their successful integration into post-war society, whether in rebuilt Germany or adopted homelands, demonstrated the potential for reconciliation and reconstruction that offered hope for a world still struggling with the legacy of total war. The bonds forged behind the barbed wire of Camp Shanks proved more durable than the political alliances that had created and resolved their captivity. In letters exchanged across oceans, reunion gatherings organized decades later, and memories preserved in family histories, the German women auxiliaries and their American guards maintained connections that testified to the transformative power of human contact across the deepest divides. Their story reminds us that even in warfare's darkest chapters, individuals retained the capacity for growth, understanding, and change. The women who had once served the Third Reich and the Americans who had guarded them discovered that shared experience could bridge seemingly insurmountable differences, creating possibilities for reconciliation that extended far beyond the circumstances that had brought them together. The experiences of the German women auxiliaries in American prisoner of war camps represent one of the most fascinating and least known chapters of World War II's aftermath. These women, communications specialists, nurses, logistics personnel, and other support staff, found themselves in an unprecedented situation that challenged every assumption about warfare, captivity, and the nature of enemy identity. Their stories remind us that behind the grand narratives of military strategy and political negotiation were individual human beings whose lives were forever changed by circumstances often beyond their control. The relationships they formed with their American captors, the choices they made about their post-war futures, and the ways they adapted to captivity and freedom offer profound insights into the complexity of war and the possibility of reconciliation. In our current world, where international tensions and cultural misunderstandings continue to create conflicts, the example of Camp Shanks offers hope that even the deepest enmities can be overcome through mutual respect, practical cooperation, and recognition of shared humanity. The German auxiliary personnel and their American guards proved that former enemies could become friends, that understanding could replace hatred, and that the bonds formed through shared experience could transcend the political circumstances that had created their original opposition. This remarkable chapter in military history deserves to be remembered not as a curiosity or footnote, but as testimony to the human capacity for growth, forgiveness, and transformation, even in the most challenging circumstances. The women who lived this experience, and the Americans who shared it with them, demonstrated that the end of war could mark the beginning of understanding, that captivity could become the foundation for freedom, and that enemies could become the builders of a more peaceful world. If you found this incredible story as fascinating as we did, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that like button. It really helps us continue bringing you these amazing untold stories from history. What did you think about the relationship between the German auxiliaries and their American guards? Were you surprised by how differently female prisoners of war were treated compared to their male counterparts? Let us know in the comments below what other forgotten stories from World War II you'd like us to explore. There are so many incredible human stories from this period that deserve to be remembered and understood.